Hello, everyone. I'm Marty Murray, Chief Curriculum and Content Architect for Target Test Prep. I do a lot of work on verbal, and one of the topics that's really near and dear to my heart is critical reasoning. I find it kind of a key topic of the GMAT because the GMAT is basically a reasoning test. So critical reasoning kind of gets at the heart of what the GMAT is all about. So we're going to have some great fun today, going through some key critical reasoning tips to get a top GMAT verbal score. I think you'll get some key foundational stuff, and then we'll also go through some questions to see what we need to do to get critical reasoning questions correct. So without further ado, let's begin with the presentation. If you want to tell me where you're from, make sure you can hear me out there. That'd be great too. I'm ready to go. So if you can cue up the presentation, that'd be great. Okay. So as I said, we're going to do some tips today for a top critical reasoning score. And the first thing I want to talk about is the foundation of this. The foundation of doing anything really is understanding what you're up against, right? What you're looking to accomplish. I think they've found that, for instance, if you're trying to see how high you can jump higher with your eyes open. And I would think that if you're really somebody who's trying to like dunk a basketball, is more likely to do it if you have the net in front of you. If someone says, well, jump as high as you need to, you know it's much clearer. It's much easier to meet your goal if you know exactly what it is. So hello to India. I see we have somebody from Portugal, somebody from Indianapolis. So we're coming from all over the place. Welcome to this fun game we're going to talk about here. So the first thing we want to talk about is the nature of the critical reasoning game so that we know what we're shooting for, right? And here's the thing. It's easy to get the impression that critical reasoning is, I don't know, kind of a game we play. We learn a few tricks. Oh, what do I have to do to get this kind of choice? We learn a few patterns and we get the critical reasoning questions correct. And the thing is, that's not really true at all. So for instance, critical reasoning is not a word matching game. It's very tempting to think, well, I should find the choice that looks the most like the passage, but that's not really going to work. And as we'll see in some of the questions we're going to do here. Another thing is, thinking once again, it's a game of using tricks to choose answers. For instance, you might think, oh, well, some choices are too extreme, or some choices compare things that aren't really similar, and these are never correct. Or we should pre-think the answer. And if I can come up with a pre-thought answer and then look for it, I'll get this correct. There's so many little tricks people try to use to get critical reasoning questions correct. And here's why they don't really work. The reason they don't really work is the critical reasoning is not this kind of game. It's actually a fairly sophisticated logic game, okay? And this kind of fits, or it definitely fits, because critical reasoning is part of the GMAT, which is a test for entrance to graduate school. So, if someone's testing you to see, well, how ready are you for our graduate business program? They're probably not going to give you a test where you can get questions correct using little tricks, because when you're analyzing business cases or going through business plans or analyzing investments or anything else, you're not going to be using little tricks to determine what really works. You're going to be using fairly sophisticated logic, right? So as all through your MBA program and in business afterward, right? So in critical reasoning, to test you to see how ready you are to do that, it's going to match it by being a fairly sophisticated logic game. So when you're thinking of critical reasoning, I want you to think of it in terms of, well, what kind of thinking would I need to use to analyze a business case? Or something like that. It's that level of analysis. So that's why, people don't normally get super high verbal scores right away. Generally, people have to prepare, right, to learn to think in this way. And that's why it takes a while. But the key thing is to realize what you're preparing for, right? So that way your preparation will be effective. And so what we're preparing for in the case of critical reasoning is a fairly sophisticated logic game. Okay, let's talk about some keys to critical reasoning success. Now, one of them, if we're playing a fairly sophisticated logic game, we have to notice what's going on. So it's so key to notice details. I know people talk about elements of the passages and conclusions and all, different types of answer choices and different types of question types. But I tell you what, none of that's going to get you to correct answers unless you're noticing details. And sometimes it can be a little detail right near the beginning of the passage that makes all the difference. So noticing details is going to be a key part of this. Noticing, well, what does this choice really say? What does this comparison really mean? What's really being compared? What exactly is the conclusion? All these things, noticing these exact details, which brings us to our next key to critical reasoning success, and that's precision. So, okay, yes, we need to notice details, but we also have to be precise in everything we're doing. We have to be precise in our thinking. We have to be precise in how we read the passages. For instance, often people, identifying the conclusion is a key part of answering many types of critical reasoning questions. But if you don't identify it precisely, then it's almost worse than not identifying it at all, because you just have some vague idea and then they can throw all kinds of traps at you, right? So precision is huge. You have to be so precise when you read an answer choice. What precisely does it say? Not what vaguely does it say. Yes, it says something about unemployment. What does it say about unemployment? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it not changing? Is it expected to change? Is it definitely changed? It changed in the past. What does it say precisely? We have to be so precise. And there's a hidden benefit to being precise too. Not only does it help us to get questions correct, but it helps us to get them correct faster. And as we all know, the GMAT is a time test. So we need to get critical reasoning questions correct fast in order to complete the verbal section on time. So precision, the hidden benefit of being precise, is that you'll get the questions done faster. And to explain why that would work, well, if you know the conclusion precisely, then you're going to get the right answer faster, because you're not going to be going through choices saying, well, which one is really correct? Because you're going to have the precise information you need. Whereas if you did it vaguely, you end up circling through the answer choices. Well, you can't really tell which one is the best because you weren't being precise enough all along. So precision is going to help us get questions correct and help us get them correct faster. Now, part of what we're going to be seeing in all this noticing details and precision is logical implications. We're going to see logical implications in the questions we go through. But this is the core of critical reasoning, is seeing logical implications. And it's interesting, we recently added a logical implications, a long lesson with some examples to the Target Test Prep Introduction to Critical Reasoning chapter. And I've had a few people say, this was a game changer for me. They actually had gone through much of the critical reasoning course without realizing how important logical implications are. And I tell you the difference between what you might have heard in logical implications. Logical implications is basically, what is the result of this fact? Or what does this fact imply for us, And that's super important when you're looking at each answer choice. Well, what does this mean? And it goes beyond what we often hear people talk about, well, what's in scope or what's out of scope, right? Or what's relevant or irrelevant. Well, something can be in scope and still not have much of the logical implications we need. Or something could be, you see what I'm saying? So that we can have three answer choices that are in scope. So then what do we do? I've seen people say, well, now I don't know what to do because these answer choices are all in scope. These two choices are both in scope. Well, what you need to do is see the logical implications of the choice. Well, what does this mean to us? How does this affect the argument? What does this do to the passage? If you see the logical implications, you're going way further in critical reasoning. That's how you get from the average level of critical reasoning to that top verbal score we're talking about. Another thing we need to do, and this is another key to critical reasoning success, is make common sense connections. This is huge. So we're seeing logical implications, and then we say, well, let's connect this choice to the passage, or let's connect these statements in the passage together, or these statements with the choice. What happens? What's going on here? Like if a passage talks about the economy, okay, the economy is growing. Well, and then there's an answer choice that says something about employment. Well, there's going to be connections between those two facts, right? Well, a growing economy affects employment, or employment affects the economy, right? What's the circle of logical implications here? And we're going to see this once again in the questions we look at. We're going to make common sense connections. How does this connect? This is interesting too, because I was talking about the in scope versus not in scope. Well, sometimes a choice won't look relevant It won't look as if it's in scope, and you'll say, well, this has nothing to do with the passage. The passage is about dolphins, and this choice is about rocks, or this choice is about clouds, or this choice is about the sea level. It says nothing about dolphins, right? Well, maybe there's a connection between the sea level and the dolphins, that we can make a common sense connection. And, or maybe there's a connection between these rocky shores or something in the dolphins, that we can say, well, gosh, what does that mean? If the rocky shores are great for protecting bait fish. Well, do dolphins eat fish? Yes, so maybe that has something to do with the dolphins. So we have to learn to make these common sense connections. And then finally, one I thought I'd throw in there is intensity. And this is huge. These questions can be annoying. They can be tough to see what the answer choices are. We only have a couple of minutes to answer each question. So being intense is going to make a big difference when we're answering critical reasoning questions. Let's say you're going through that weekend question, right? And you don't see what's relevant, and you're not making the common sense connections. Well, you have a choice. Which answer choice is correct? I don't know. Well, you have a choice. You can either be super intense and go, I'm going to get this right. Or you can say, I don't really see it. And which one is going to present a better result to you, right? Which one is going to get you to that correct answer is being super intense. And I can even tell you, speaking from experience, when I took the GMAT myself the last time, I finally figured out how intense I had to be. I would go through the verbal section and say, well, I spent enough time on this question. Okay, great. And I would even finish early. And then, and I wouldn't get my score. I wouldn't hit my score goal. Well, I wasn't being that intense, right? And then I learned, be intense. And I finally hit my score goal. And I've seen this happen with other people as well. One person in particular wasn't happy with, she didn't feel as if she had done that well in the quant section. And she was super intense with the verbal section. And, she ended up scoring much higher than she normally does in verbal, just intensity. So intensity is going to make a big difference. Go through those answer choices. You're going to go back to you don't see the answer, go to the choices, go to the passage, go somewhere else. Look at the question again. Make sure you read it. You're so intense. Go. That's how you're going to get these right when you're taking the test. That intensity could make an 80-point difference in your score, I'm sure. Okay. So let's let's sum up some key things we have to do to master critical reasoning with all that in mind. One, we're going to learn critical reasoning concepts. Okay, so there's elements of the argument, background information, the premises, the conclusion. Learn all these different concepts, whether for evaluate questions, well, what's going on in this, the assumptions and the assumption questions. Learn the concepts. Makes a big difference. Having the foundation in concepts really gets you started off well. Okay, the second thing we want to do is learn effective strategies. It makes such a difference to have an effective strategy. For one thing, it's great to get you through. Once again, we're all concerned about speed on this test. If you have an effective strategy, well, you know exactly what to do. You're not fumbling around. You're not going, well, we can all get, let's say, a strength in the argument question correct, right? You go through the argument, you look for the conclusion. Okay, well, what makes it correct? Okay, great. But there are key steps we can take in order. And if you know what those are, you won't be muddling your way through the question. And this goes for all of GMAT Verbal. Reading comprehension as well. If you have a good strategy for a detail question or an inference question or a primary purpose question, all these strategies are going to help you get through the questions faster. So learning a strategy helps you get through the question faster. Also, the other thing about learning a strategy, it's going to help you get the questions right more often, because you're going to take the steps you really need to take, and you're not going to take steps you shouldn't be taking. So having getting something that's reliably effective is going to help you get correct answers more often. Finally, we want to learn, and we want to learn the strategies. The next thing is practicing to develop skill. Okay, and I got to say that this is the weak link in many people's prep. Okay, you really want to make sure your practice is on. And for critical reasoning, it's super important. You want to really be analyzing the answer choices carefully. You're going to see how we're going to go through the answer choices and the questions we look at. But practicing is huge. I've written about this recently, how it's often the weak link in people's prep. They say, I know the concepts, I know the strategies. Okay. Well, then I say, well, how have you been practicing? And, well, I did a dozen week and a dozen strength and questions. I did a dozen assumption questions. That's not enough. And also I did them all time with a timer going this way, I'm going to learn, or I just went through the official guide. Yeah, none of these things are really going to get you to your score goal. You need to do topic focused, on time practice, shoot for high accuracy. I'm going to talk about this a little more toward the end of the presentation, but practice is a huge part of your practice. Okay, so to sum up, we're not going to learn critical reasoning methods that don't really work. These gimmicky things. Oh, just eliminate extreme choices. Whatever it is. If as long as they are looking for patterns in the answer choices that are. I mean, yes, patterns help us a little bit, but it's just some gimmicky method. Don't expect it to work. It might get you to an average critical reasoning score, a 50th percentile score, but if you're watching this presentation, you're probably looking for a higher score than that. Okay, do expect critical reasoning to be sophisticated and learn fundamental concepts. So fundamental concepts and logic-based strategies. And this is going to help you for another reason. I hear a lot of people saying, well, the real GMAT is harder than the practice test. I scored at one level on a practice test, and I scored way lower on the real GMAT. It really rocked me. I don't even know what happened. What happened is, in many cases, especially in verbals, people didn't learn fundamental concepts and logic-based strategies. They learned patterns, okay? And those patterns are based on past GMAT questions that people have seen before. So yeah, they work great on practice tests, which are based on past questions, okay? A lot of time people learn just what's on the practice test. Yeah, they learn all the patterns. You have to learn fundamental general things that are going to apply anywhere, okay? This is so key. So that way, when you see a freaky question on the real test that you've never seen anything like on the practice test, then you know how to handle it. Well, it's a weekend question, but gosh, these choices, this passage doesn't look anything I've seen before. But you know the fundamentals. You know how premises work. You know how the arguments work. You know how to analyze them. And then you have logic-based strategies. And you're not just looking for patterns. There's key steps that are logic-based you're going to take. And that way you'll do just as well on the real test as you're doing on your practice test, okay? And once again, keep in mind that GMAT Verbal is part of an entrance exam for business school, and treat the questions with respect. I mean, I know this, I don't know, maybe this sounds obvious to some of you, but I've seen it so often, that's why I'm bringing it up, is people think, well, these verbal questions are just words, or these reading comprehension questions. It's so basic, I just have to read this and see what matches up. You got to treat it with some respect. This is an exam for graduate school, so keep that in mind as you're answering the questions. We have a question, what resources do I recommend for practicing? Well, any resource that will give you categorized practice is going to be the best, So clearly, like a self-study course like the Target Test Prep course gives you a lot of topic-focused questions so that you can learn one thing at a time. For instance, if you do 30 inference questions in a row, you're going to get way better at inference than you will if you do an inference and then a weekend and then an assumption, then an evaluate, then a complete the passage. You see what I'm saying, right? Because you're going to learn from okay, you get one question wrong and you get smoked in a certain way. Well, then the third question you see after that is going to try to smoke you in the same way, So but the next time you won't get full again, or maybe the third time you won't get full again. That's kind of what I experienced, is that I would get fooled once, maybe fooled twice, but the third time I would not get fooled in the same way. How do you know that you're on top of those skills? Good question. You know your skills are developing when you're achieving super high accuracy, and you do your practice, you're doing your practice questions on time, and you're achieving 90% accuracy or 100% accuracy in easy, preferably something close to 100% in easy. I like for verbal above 90% in medium, really, because that's the medium questions, medium difficulty questions are the foundation of getting a high score. And then in the hard questions, at least 70%. So if you're getting that kind of percentages, your skills are on. And if you're not ready. A lot of people say, well, I get most of the questions correct. Well, most is more than 50%, and that might feel pretty good. And even 70% might feel pretty good. But the thing is, to get a high verbal score, you have to get a super high percentage of the verbal questions correct. So it's better to shoot for like 90% in medium questions and even 80% or maybe 90% in hard questions if you really want to get a high verbal score. But anyway, the way you know you're ready is that you're achieving high accuracy on time. And then you can try to work, then you work on time practice to get yourself up to test pace. But first, you want to get to a super high accuracy on time. Okay. Okay, so we're going to hit some questions. And as we go through these, I want you to think about what we talked about. We talked about noticing details, noticing logical implications. Precision is super key, right? And you want to be intense and really careful. And I didn't bring easy questions today because to really learn some of these things and see how they apply, we want to go through some pretty challenging questions, because things you could get right with word matching or things you could get right with gimmicky methods are not going to really illustrate what we're talking about critical reasoning tips for a high verbal score, right? So you really want to nail this stuff. So let's see. Here's our first question. And just, yeah, if you can put your answers in the chat, and just hold off for a couple minutes, please, so that everybody has a chance to look at the question without being influenced by other people's choices, because this is a tricky question. So I want people to really have a chance to think about it on their own. Okay, what do you think? Any other thoughts? Even some best guesses. What do we think is going on? It's a super tricky question to think about what might have to be assumed. Okay. So we have a few different opinions coming in. Definitely a variety. Gonna go through it and maybe take another 15 seconds to look at it, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so let's go through this question. It says, Press Secretary, our critics claim that the president's recent highway project cancellations demonstrate a vindictive desire to punish legislative districts controlled by opposition parties. So this is someone else's conclusion. Our critics have a conclusion, right? They offer as evidence for their conclusion that 90% of the projects canceled were in such districts. Okay. But all of the canceled projects have been identified as wasteful in a report written by respected nonpartisan auditors. So the president's choice was clearly motivated by sound budgetary policy, not partisan politics. Okay. So there's a lot of details in here, a lot going on. Do we have to be super precise to see that the conclusion here is so the president's choice was clearly motivated by sound budgetary policy. We see so is introducing a conclusion, and then it says not partisan politics, right? So this is the press secretary's exact conclusion. We're going to identify it exactly, because if we don't, we're going to get smoked, okay? So how does the press secretary support this conclusion? All of the canceled projects, starting on the third line from the bottom, have been identified as wasteful in a report written by respected nonpartisan auditors. They had been identified as wasteful. So the projects were wasteful. So the president wasn't trying to, there was no partisan politics. It was just sound budgetary policy. Okay. So there's some kind of difference here between these two things. One is they weren't wasteful, or they were wasteful. And the other was that they were motivated by sound budgetary policy. The fact that something is wasteful doesn't necessarily mean it was a good idea to eliminate it, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that, I'm sorry, it probably does mean it's a good idea to eliminate it, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't partisan politics involved. What are we assuming there? Let's see. Let's be very careful with this. So we got the details, we've been precise with the conclusion and the evidence. So let's look at the question. Which of the following is an assumption on which the press secretary's argument depends? So we can see that this is an assumption question, and we've identified the conclusion, so we're all set and to go to these answer choices. So let's take a look at the logical implications of these choices, because we need something that implies that it was indeed sound budgetary policy. Okay, A, canceling highway projects was not the only way for the president to punish legislative districts controlled by opposition parties. So what does this imply? The press secretary let's say the press secretary is assuming that it was not the only way. Well, what's the implications of that? Okay, there could have been other ways, right? There could have been other ways. Well, does that mean that this is motivated by sound budgetary policy? Does the press secretary have to assume that it's not the only way, that there are other ways to punish them? No, right? Okay, so there are not other ways. Does that mean he was punishing them? The president was punishing legislative districts, even if this was the only way to do it? Certainly not. So A is out. Now I see a few people chose B here. It seems to be one of our winners. I'm going to skip B and go to C. The number of projects canceled was a significant proportion of all the highway projects that will be undertaken by the government in the near future. Okay, the number of projects canceled was a significant proportion. So what does this imply? They're most of the ones canceled. I mean, the ones canceled were most of the ones that were undertaken. What if they weren't? What would the implications of that be? They weren't a significant proportion. Does that mean that the president was punishing the other party if they weren't a large proportion? Not really, right? Is that an implication? Let's think about not whether it's in scope and whether it sounds good or feels like something the passage says. But really, let's negate this choice and think about the implications. The number of projects was not a significant proportion. It was a small proportion, right, of all the highway projects. Oh, does that mean the president was punishing anybody? No, right? Is that an implication of that? How do we can't jump from small proportion to punishment. They're two different things. And we'd like to in our minds, I'm sure we would, okay? So that's the thing about these choices. Look how tricky it is. Oh, it's a significant proportion. You're saying it's significant. It's just written to sound correct. But if we negate this and say it wasn't a significant proportion, it still has no implications that show that it was done to punish the opposition party. Okay. Let's try D. The highway projects canceled in districts controlled by the president's party were not generally more expensive than the projects canceled in districts controlled by opposition parties. Let's think about this. The highway projects canceled have to be so intense. What is the implication of this? So let's negate this. The highway projects canceled in districts controlled by the president's party were more expensive. Well, that would imply that the president is not punishing anybody, because the president killed expensive projects in the president's district, right? So that would do it. So they're saying that they're not more expensive. Well, why would we have to assume that all the cheap projects, what is the implications of that? Think about it. Don't just, say, okay, it sounds right. It sounds so important. They were this comparison. They were not generally more expensive. Oh yeah, that tells me. But we have to just get a high verbal score to get these assumption questions correct. We have to really see the logical implications. And this is basically saying they were less expensive, right? Or I don't know. They at least weren't more expensive. Well, we don't have to assume they're more expensive, because they were more expensive. Then the president would be wrecking his own projects, his big projects, his big expensive projects, right? So no, this one, the logical implications of this are not necessary. D is out. How about E? Reports by nonpartisan auditors are generally regarded by the opposition party as a source of objective assessment. Okay, now the issue with this is the press secretary does mention respected nonpartisan auditor. But let's look really very precisely at this choice. Respected by nonpartisan auditors are generally not regarded by the opposition party as a source of objective assessment. Wait, so is this press secretary assuming that the president didn't punish people and using the evidence of respected nonpartisan auditors and saying, I assume that the other people are not going to believe this? Is that how you argue? So you see how we really have to check out the implications here, because this is the opposite of what we need. We're assuming that they are not regarded as objective assessments. Well, that wouldn't support his argument at all, right? Wouldn't support the press secretary's argument at all if other people thought that the evidence was not even objective. So this goes in entirely the opposite direction of what we wanted to, what we need here. And notice though, it's easy to choose this choice. A lot of people choose E, okay? But so looking at if you go through this question, you look for what's in scope, what's out of scope, you're doomed. And if you want to get to a high verbal score, that the top percentiles, you really need to use the logical implications. And in this case, E is a popular choice, but it's also incorrect. So let's look at B, which doesn't necessarily jump out at us as really relevant here. The highway projects were not mostly projects in districts controlled by the president's party. What does this even have to do with it? They weren't mostly it sounds as if it should not be the answer, because it's saying what was not controlled by the president's party. I don't know. So that probably has nothing to do with the president, right? But let's take a look at our details. They offer, let's go back up. When you don't see what's going on in critical reasoning, bounce back up to the passage. So let's bounce back up to the passage and look at this middle part. They offer as evidence the fact that 90% of the projects canceled were in such districts. Such districts is a look above marker. What are the such districts? legislative districts controlled by opposition parties. So the people from the other critics are saying that the president, most of the 90% of the projects canceled were in other districts. And he's saying, well, look, yeah, but the nonpartisan auditors are saying all the projects are wasteful, so I don't know what you're talking about. Well, what about this? The press secretary is assuming that most of the projects were not mostly in districts controlled by the president's party, right? Well, what if they were? Let's negate this. The scheduled highway projects identified as wasteful were mostly in districts controlled by the president's party, but the president canceled them in the other districts, mostly. Well, that would sound pretty vindictive, wouldn't it? Because wait, most of the wasteful projects were in your district, and most of the ones canceled were in the other district. So if we negate B, the implication is that the president had something going on. Something going on, namely, you're mostly canceling projects in other districts, and most of the wasteful ones are in your district. In that case, you would expect most of them to be canceled in the president's district. So the press secretary is assuming that most of the projects identified as wasteful weren't in the president's own districts, or the president's party's own districts. Is that clear to everybody? That B is why B is correct. Because in order for it to say, well, they were all wasteful, so it wasn't punishing, you have to assume that most of the wasteful projects weren't in your own district. Someone wants to know what level question this is. This is it's a high 700 level question. Okay. But notice, okay, so we went through this question, and it was super tricky, and we all picked different choices, right? And it's a great variety of different ideas, but notice how important it was to look for logical implications. As soon as you see the implications of the choice, E, for instance, is a very popular choice in this question. But if you really think about it, if the opposition parties do not regard the reports by nonpartisan auditors as objective assessment, that is certainly something the press secretary would not be assuming, because that would be assuming against yourself. Now, if you just look at it and say, well, I don't know, this sounds right because it's about the opposition parties, about the objective assessment, it's about the nonpartisan auditors, sounds right. Yeah, you're going to choose it. So you really have to think about those details and the logical implications. So what was the key detail here? This 90% up in line 3 of the passage. 90% of the projects canceled were in the other districts. That was a real detail. So notice how noticing the details and being super precise and seeing the logical implications were in this case. Okay, so we have a few questions. Do we have any tips to resolve the paradox? We are going to do resolve the paradox next. I don't have any tips right now for weekend and boldface, but the Target Test Prep course has a chapter on boldface that I really like. It's a game changer because it shows you exactly how to go through those questions. We also have a chapter on weekend that covers a great strategy for weekend, so you can certainly go through it there. Does the negation technique work for all cases? I guess theoretically it does, but in some cases it's so hard to see what an exact negation is. You kind of have to more negate it. Well, what if this were not true? Sometimes you just have to put "it is not the case that" in front of a choice. It is not the case that X, Y, Z. You can't necessarily always just change a not. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 nots in the thing, or sometimes it's really, really hard to negate the choice, and you just have to say, well, what if this weren't true? I mean, it's always going to be the case that if the assumption were not true, the argument wouldn't work. So in some sense, negating always works, but a basic negation of removing a not or adding a not isn't always, you can't always do something that simple. So the right answer for an assumption sheet always either support or defend conclusions. Yeah, basically. In fact, in some cases, they'll ask you, instead of saying which is an assumption, they'll say which strengthens the argument, and the strengthener is an assumption, by the way. So yeah, it does help to think of it that way. The right answer, I guess, identifying the conclusion is very important. Absolutely, and identifying it precisely. All too often, people don't identify the conclusion precisely, and then they can slip anything by you because you don't really know what you're looking to support. Okay, so you see how what we're talking about here, how we had to be so careful, so intense, so precise, so detail-oriented to get this hard question correct. Any more questions about this one? Okay, let's move on to another question. This is a paradox question. It's also really tricky, but I think if you've seen what we're doing with these logical implications here. So if you do the same thing in this next question to see, well, what is the logical implication of each choice? You're going to have a high probability of getting this next question correct because each choice has a particular logical implication. If you can really figure out what that is, you're not going to fall into the traps. Once again, a couple minutes. The last word of choice E is immigrants. It's immigrants. You can't really see it. Okay, before we hop on this, someone's asking what the conclusion for the last one was. It was the president's choice was clearly motivated by sound budgetary policy, not partisan politics. That's the conclusion. So what do we need to assume to say that? Well, yeah, they were all wasteful, but you're assuming that they weren't all in the president's district. Yeah, in this case, the conclusion is the last line, although it isn't all. Okay, back to our paradox question. And once again, if you could hold off for a couple minutes before you put your choices in the chat, that would be great. Any ideas? Just think, what's the logical implication of each choice? What does this mean? What would each choice explain, right? Because we're trying to explain what's going on. So what would each choice explain? That's how we need to go through these. Give it another 30 seconds. Take a good look. Okay. Any other guesses, best feelings? We got a few. We have a consensus on choice A so far. Anyone going to argue with that? Who's got an argument with that? Okay, let's go through this. And let's read the passage carefully. We have to always read carefully when we're doing GMAT verbal preparation or taking the test, right? We want to read super carefully, get in the mode of totally getting the passage. I've seen people's critical reasoning performance just dramatically change just from reading the passage more carefully. So let's go through it. An experimental program in France involved having hiring companies that received resumes from the state employment agency volunteer to receive the resumes they got from the agency in anonymous form, i.e., without applicants' names or addresses. Okay, so it's an experimental program. Companies that normally receive resumes from the state employment agency volunteer to receive the resumes without applicants' names or addresses. The purpose of the program was to determine whether using such resumes would reduce hiring discrimination against recent immigrants, who often could be identified as such as a result of their names or places of residence. So interesting. Okay, surprisingly, while participating in the program, the companies reduced rather than increased their hiring of recent immigrants. Okay, so we have you can tell, by the way, without even reading the question, we probably have a paradox question here because, we have a paradoxical situation. They took the immigrants' names and addresses off, so now we can't, or everybody's names and addresses off, so now you can't really tell who's an immigrant. But the number of immigrants, the percentage of immigrants hired, the hiring of recent immigrants went down. So why would that happen? What would explain that? And let's see what the question is. So our next step is to check the question. Which of the following, if true, best explains why the results of the program were different from those that might have been reasonably expected? So we can see that this is a best explains or paradox question because we're trying to explain, well, why were the results so different from what might have been reasonably expected? So we're going to need a choice that does that. So let's make sure we totally get the passage because all this precision and noticing details, it's an experimental program. The same companies are getting resumes from the state employment agency. The difference is they're getting them without the names and addresses, so they can't tell who's a recent immigrant, supposedly. And it's names and addresses, and the companies reduced rather than increased their hiring of recent immigrants. So we're trying to explain why they reduced their hiring of recent immigrants. It didn't go up like they expected, it went down. Direction is key in critical reasoning, so they reduced their hiring. Which one of these choices would explain it? So look how perfect this is when we're talking about logical implications, because what we're looking for is a choice that has the logical implications of the companies would reduce their hiring of recent immigrants, right? Because the names and addresses weren't on there anymore. So why would they reduce their hiring? In France, looking at A, the resumes of recent immigrants are more likely to include significant gaps in work history than are those of other job applicants. Okay. So they're more likely to include significant gaps in work history. So what's the logical implication of this? The logical implication of this is that generally immigrants are going to be hired less, right? I agree. And that's why probably a lot of people chose this choice. But here's the thing. Does that mean that they would be hired even less if you didn't know who they were? What changed? Would the logical implications of this fact explain a change? Because we have to explain a change. We have to explain why the companies reduced their hiring. Didn't the resumes always have those gaps? Everybody get that? They always had those gaps. So would the logical implication of something that always existed explain a decrease? I don't think so. Right? They always had that problem. They always had the gaps. So that wouldn't explain a new change. How about B? No companies known to have track records of hiring discrimination against recent immigrants participated in the program. Okay. So looking at B, no companies known to have track records of hiring discrimination against recent immigrants participated in the program. Okay. So these companies that had the track records of discrimination didn't participate. Does that explain a decrease? Why would it? Right? Okay, these companies don't have track records of discrimination. But okay, so why would their hiring go down? We don't even know who we're hiring now. So they weren't discriminating before. They shouldn't be discriminating now. There shouldn't be any change, right? So B, the implications of B is that everything should basically stay the same. Nobody was discriminating before, and now they don't have their even their names and addresses anymore. So they still shouldn't be discriminating, right? So B would imply that shouldn't be any real change at all. So if we're looking carefully at the logical implications, B is out. Does everyone get why? If anyone doesn't get why B is out, let me know. How about C? In addition to receiving anonymous resumes from the agency, the companies involved in the program continue to receive resumes with names and addresses directly from private individuals. Okay. So things kind of stayed the same. With the logical implications, so basically they kept getting resumes that they normally get. The names with resumes and names and addresses directly from private individuals. Would that cause them to change their hiring practices? Did anybody pick C? Yeah, okay. One or two. So, okay, so they in addition to receiving anonymous resumes, some things stayed the same. Well, the implications of things staying the same would not be a decrease, right? We need something that implies that things would have gone down with regard to hiring recent immigrants. And this is saying that some things stayed the same. Doesn't do the job. But look what we're doing here. In each case, we're just looking at these logical implications and seeing whether they imply that there would be a change. That's how you do a paradox. Paradox question. What has the logical implication of what needs to be explained? And here we need to explain a decrease. So which one will have the logical implication that things would decrease? How about D? In many cases, it is possible to determine via considering aspects of a resume other than name and address that it's likely that an applicant is a recent immigrant. Oh, no kidding. So they could still tell who are the recent immigrants. That's pretty tempting. So I'm going to keep D. How about E? The hiring practices of most of the companies that volunteer to receive anonymous resumes, including making allowances for minor deficiencies in resumes of recent immigrants. Well, I don't know. Wouldn't that explain an increase? They're making allowances for minor deficiencies. So I don't know. D almost looks better because in many cases, it's possible to determine that the names and addresses are likely an applicant is a recent immigrant. Okay, so they could still tell who the recent immigrants are. That totally explains why it decreased. Does it? Not necessarily, because couldn't they tell that before? So what difference does this make? D, once again, implies that there's no change. They could tell before because they had the names and addresses. Now they can still tell without the names and addresses. So D is implying that nothing changed or things didn't change that much, right? Yeah, Interesting. D does not explain the decrease because it doesn't explain a change. So it certainly sounds right, but remember what we were talking about. You have to be so precise. D would explain why they didn't hire recent immigrants, even though they couldn't see their names and addresses. But D wouldn't explain why it changed, because all it's saying is they still know who the recent immigrants are. But they already knew that before. That's why we have to be so precise, because we don't need to explain why recent immigrants don't get hired. We have to explain a decrease. And D doesn't explain that because it shows how things look pretty much the same. Somebody's asking, well, what's the difference between A and D? Really not much. But the difference between A and D, there is a key difference. One is anybody could have a significant gap in work history. So that would cause recent immigrants to be hired less in general, because of the same thing that would cause other people to be not hired by. D is a little different. It's kind of saying, well, if you were discriminating against recent immigrants just because they are recent immigrants, you could still do it even if you didn't have the name and address. Significant gaps in resume is an assumption since it was not mentioned in the argument. Here's the thing. Critical reasoning answer choices often have new information in them. And that's a key thing to understand. So, and we talk about this extensively in the target test prep course, but you know, when you're preparing for critical reasoning, don't get the impression that the choices should match the passage. Often they have completely new information. So the answer choice, we need new information. We need something new. This information that's in the passage is not explaining the decrease, right? In option C, if they keep receiving resumes from private individuals, they absolutely do get to know about the candidate. That could have influenced the hiring process. But notice it says they are still receiving. They continue to receive resumes from private individuals. So this is something that was going on all along, right? Something was going on all along. We can't explain the change with something that was going on all along. And so you can see how we have to be so careful with these logical implications, so intense, so precise with what we're looking at. We need to explain a decrease, and the fact that things stayed the same does not explain a decrease. Okay. Okay, so let's look at E. The hiring practices of most of the companies that volunteered to receive anonymous resumes included making allowances for minor deficiencies in resumes of recent immigrants. Oh, wait a minute. So look at this. Remember, we're talking about common sense connections. Well, they normally include making allowances for minor deficiencies in resumes of recent immigrants. Well, what if they don't know you're a recent immigrant? Can they make an allowance for a minor deficiency in your resume? They can't, right? So the common sense connection here is, wait, well, and the logical implication. So the common sense connection is, wait, this is connected to hiring recent immigrants. It's saying that if you don't have the information, you're probably not going to hire as many recent immigrants because now you know no longer who they are and you can't make the allowances. So the logical implication of E is that without the information, they're going to hire fewer recent immigrants because they're no longer making allowances for the minor deficiencies. Is that clear to everybody? Because E is indeed the correct answer, right? The implication of E is if you don't know who it is, you can't make allowances for minor deficiencies. So you see how we have to make those common sense connections. And this is a theme through all of critical reasoning, right? So as you're doing your critical reasoning preparation, think to yourself, what are the logical implications of this choice? You could go through each choice. In fact, often I show people, look, go through the first choice. Is it a weaken, a strengthen? What does it do? Does it explain? Does it constrain? Does it tell what the degree something is? What does the choice do? Even if you know it's not correct, identify what it does. And in this case, this implies that they can no longer make allowances for recent immigrants, right? So they can't make allowances. They end up hiring them less than they used to because they don't any longer know who they are. Does anybody have any questions about this one? Okay. Let's look at, so yeah, some people still wonder about answer choice E. The hiring practices of most of the companies that volunteered to receive anonymous resumes included making allowances for minor deficiencies in resumes of recent immigrants. The word immigrants is hidden here a little bit. Okay? They make allowances for minor deficiencies. So that was their hiring practice. Now, what if they don't know who a recent immigrant is? They can no longer make an allowance. So let's say you have a gap in your resume or some issue with your resume that looks a little odd. But normally they say, well, this is a recent immigrant. You know, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. This is a recent immigrant, even though, I don't know, she's missing this part of her education, we're going to give her the benefit of the doubt. But now they don't know who the recent immigrants are. So they see her resume and they don't know that she's a recent immigrant. So they can't make an allowance. They just have to do it the same as they would for anybody. So they can't make allowances. So now they're no longer hiring as many recent immigrants because, as you know, if there's any minor deficiencies, they can't make allowances, whether they're gaps in employment or gaps in education or whatever else they were doing. So they end up hiring fewer recent immigrants because they don't know who they are. And that's really what we needed here, isn't it? Because we know that the change was that they no longer know who the recent immigrants are. So then we need something that follows from the fact that you no longer know who the recent immigrants are. You're going to hire them less. And E does that perfectly. Any other questions about this one? Okay. So let's sum a couple things up. So GRE, I mean, critical reasoning preparation, we need to do a few key things. One is we work on one question type at a time, okay? And this works great for all GMAT preparation. Working on one question type is great because you can learn all about the question type. Then you apply what you've just learned and you apply it over and over and over, as I was mentioning, so that you learn from each question and apply what you just learned to the next one, right? So if you do 20 weekend questions in a row, you're going to learn so much more than if you do a weekend and then a strength and etc. Okay. The next thing is this untimed practice. This is, as I was saying, people's weak link in their prep is often their practice. Practicing untimed is huge. I know a lot of people will tell you, always use your timer. You've got to learn to keep up with the time. How are you possibly going to learn to execute, go through these choices? You saw how tricky a tough question can be. How would you possibly do that the first time in 2 minutes? I know I wouldn't. You want to ponder these questions. You want to go through every answer choice, see what's incorrect, see what's correct. And this goes for quantitative and verbal, okay? Practice untimed at first. And, okay, let's say you're getting them all right on time. Now you can move on to time practice. Doesn't that make complete sense, right? And you can't get them all right untimed? Why would you do them timed? Doesn't make any sense. Now you're fighting the time and the question. Learn to get them correct first, untimed, and then move on to timed practice. As you're working and preparing for critical reasoning or any other part of verbal, analyze every answer choice and seek to articulate what it does, and in the case of critical reasoning, how it's related to the passage. So we want to articulate, we want to create our own explanations when we're practicing critical reasoning. Like as we went through these questions, notice we didn't just go quickly, oh, this choice doesn't look good, I don't like it, I think E is correct. Even if you get the question correct, that's not the greatest thing if you don't know how all the other answer choices are wrong. I see this a lot. Someone will say, yeah, B is definitely the correct answer. And I'll say, you're absolutely right. B is the correct answer. What's wrong with C? Well, I'm not really sure, but I like B better. You're not doing what you need to do to master critical reasoning in that case, okay? You want to know why every answer choice is incorrect or correct. So keep this in mind as you're preparing for, and this goes in general for preparing for reading comprehension as well. Really understand why each choice, what's the failure point, okay, in each choice, okay. Lastly, stick with questions to learn to choose between the last two choices, right? So this is key. Let's say you spent 5 minutes on a question. You eliminated 3 of the choices. You have 2 choices left, right? Stick with the question. Learn to choose between the last 2 answer choices. Really, in a way, the last 2 answer choices are where the critical reasoning game begins, okay? Because obviously, the first 3 choices are usually pretty easy to eliminate. Maybe not in these last questions we did, But, you know, normally they're pretty easy to eliminate. And even in these questions, some are more obviously incorrect. The one about the people don't regard the auditors as valid. Well, come on, that's the easiest one to eliminate in a way, because if the person who's using the evidence is not going to claim that it's not valid. So there's always some easier to eliminate choices that we can eliminate, right? So stick with the question. After you eliminate those choices, now you're down to the last two. This is where the game begins. You have to learn to get through those last two choices and figure out which one is correct. And that is really the GMAT verbal game, is choosing between the last two choices. All this precision and detail and everything else you do, reading the passages, all this stuff adds up to choosing between those last two answer choices, okay? Okay, we've covered a lot of stuff. If you're having trouble with critical reasoning, there's one thing I want to tell you. Effective preparation works, okay? So, you know, if someone will say, well, I'm just never going to get better at this, I'm never going to learn this, just keep pulling levers, okay? Because effective GMAT preparation does work. And I've seen this over and over again. People have a hard time. Then they learn to use a new method. They use a new approach to preparing. Okay, they use the streaks method. They learn some new critical reasoning strategies. They learn to be more precise. They say, oh, I can never get these. What's going on? I've had someone go from about 50% accuracy to like 80-something% accuracy in one like hour just by reading the passages more carefully, okay? So that what would that do to your score percentile, right? Going from 50% accuracy to 80% accuracy just by reading the passages more carefully, just by noticing details, just by being a little more precise, and finally just being super intense. Something will work. Effective preparation does work. So I would encourage you, if you're having trouble with critical reasoning, just think, what can I do? What levers could I pull? How can I make this happen to get to the score goal I want to achieve? And we see evidences all the time from our students at Target Test Prep who use effective preparation and nail this test over and over. We've seen the most extreme case was Dalal, who started way down at the bottom of the score range and ended up way at the top of the score range with almost perfect score, okay? And definitely we see a lot of high scores from the people reporting scores here on GMAT Club. We have a great score guarantee that, this is how confident we are with our course. And of course, you can sign up for the course for 5 days for $1 and try it out, see the whole thing. You know, if you want to get some critical reasoning strategies, then you can certainly do that by going through the course. Do we have any other questions before I go? Okay, cool. So with that, so you got the points here about the precision, the detail, and maybe possibly most of all, the intensity and the untimed practice. I think you're set up to master critical reasoning. It was really fun today hanging out and talking about this stuff. I hope you enjoyed the questions and got some good ideas you can use for your prep. Till next time, have a great day, y'all. Really appreciate it.